Most commonly, when an American president is sworn in, they spend that evening in adulation. They go and shake a bunch of hands in the crowd. Then they go to a whole series of balls and big parties and all that kind of stuff. And then the next day they'll start getting into it. Trump is not conventional, and he went almost immediately back to the office after the inauguration and started taking lots of actions. And so he's going to have an immediate impact on stuff. And then equally quick, Putin was able to respond to some of the things that Trump had said. And so we are off and running. So let's first of all just take a look at it, because last night after the inauguration, Trump went back to the Oval Office and started signing a whole series of executive orders and various actions, one of which, during the process of which he allowed the media in to videotape him signing a lot of these documents. And one of the questions at one point came up to, which was one of the big questions that we had, obviously, is about what Trump is going to do regarding the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, he had campaigned hard on ending the war. It had been one of the primary topics of discussion ever since he was elected. And then at the inaugural address, he literally never mentioned the word Ukraine or Russia one single time. So after he got through with the inauguration and in his Oval Office, one of the first questions they asked about was, what are you going to do about Russia-Ukraine?
How long do you think it would take to end that conflict?
I have to speak to President Putin. We're going to have to find out. He can't be thrilled. He's not doing so well. I mean, he's grinding it out, but most people thought that war would have been over in about 1 week. And now you're into 3 years, right? So he can't be thrilled. It's not making him look very good. Now, eventually, it's a big machine, so things will happen. But I think he'd be very well off to end that war. We have numbers that almost 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed. About 700,000 Ukrainian soldiers are killed. Russia's bigger. They have more soldiers to lose. But that's no way to run a country.
So it's a little unclear what his intention was and what his thoughts are. It doesn't appear that he's, by any means ready to go back to what the Biden administration was doing, which is just to continue to sending equipment and funds and saying, we're going to hold out for a better peace or something. He says the war has to end, but it's a little bit concerning that he's saying, well, Russia has lost 1 million killed and Ukraine 700,000. So interesting on both of those numbers. On the Ukraine side, that's way more than anybody else in the West is openly talking about. So that is a substantial number, and probably closer to the actual number, which I believe from various accounts and just evidence on the ground is probably close to an actual million. But the fact that he said 700,000 is, I think the last time Zelenskyy had admitted the number, it was like some ridiculously low 31,000. So obviously nowhere near reality. But then he talks about the Russians having over 1 million killed in action. That's killed, not casualties. So you add in the wounded, which are very often times 3, generally speaking. So that would be 3 or 4 million total casualties. And I don't see any evidence of that on the ground at all. So I think that that's wrong. And if Trump believes that, and more to the point, if that's what he's being told so far by whoever his senior advisors are on this topic, and I don't know who they are, then that is problematic potentially, because if you think your enemy or your opponent, your negotiating partner, if you think these are the factors that are going into what his situation is, then you may reach a wrong conclusion because you think his motivations may be this when they're really something different. And that casualty number is pretty important, because if you understand that actually Russia is on the ascendant and they're growing and getting larger and stronger, then your negotiating style will also change, because you want to come out with anything that's beneficial to your side. And if you know where the opponent is on this, then you're going to have a better chance to find some middle ground there. And we do have some idea what Putin thinks about this. So that's what Trump said almost immediately after that, around the same time, I guess it was when it was actually said. Russia's President Vladimir Putin talked about what he was thinking, and he, interestingly enough, congratulated President Trump and said he's ready for dialogue.
And now we see their statements about wishing to restore direct contacts with Russia. suspended by the previous administration. We've heard his commitment to do everything to prevent World War III. Of course, we welcome this approach and we congratulate the newly elected President of the United States. We have never been against dialogue. We have always been ready to maintain peaceful relationship with any American administration. I have said that many times. We would like to see the dialogue built upon equality and mutual respect, considering the common positions on our country on a number of international issues, including strengthening security and political stability.
So it's interesting there and useful and optimism, causing some optimism when he says, yes, we're ready for dialogue. We were never against it. We were always willing to do it. And, the truth is, as we talked about many times here, ever since we've had this channel, that the outgoing administration of the Biden side just shut off conversation. They wouldn't talk. I mean, you saw even Anthony Blinken wouldn't talk to his counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, and certainly Biden never did after the war began in February 2022. I guess the only time during his administration he did was in June 2021, and that apparently didn't go well. So now here comes Trump in, and he's ready to say, hey, let's have a dialogue. They're both saying we want to avoid World War III. That's a really good place to start from. That means that both sides are aware that if things go sideways, that's not an outlandish possibility. It would be a catastrophic outcome, but it is possible. And as long as both sides understand that if things don't go well, that's a possibility, that's a good sign, because that means both of them are willing to do whatever it takes to make sure we don't get to there. Obviously, in any kind of negotiation, each side is also going to want to get the best outcome for its side that you can. It was important also that Russia there said, look, we're looking for equality and mutual respect. So they're not looking to lord it over anybody. They're not looking to say, hey, we're just going to dominate this deal. Because and I'll actually show later in this episode here graphically why the Russians are on the ascendancy and certainly are. The balance of power is, way out of whack on the Russian side. So they could come in and play a heavy hand, and they have the wherewithal to back it up. But so far, he's coming and saying, hey, we're willing to be reasonable, and we're willing to have a negotiated system based on mutual respect and equality. So at least so far from the Putin side, he's coming in and saying, we would like to find some version of a win-win. We're good with that. We don't want to make you look bad. We're certainly not going to look bad. Trump, for his part, even his conversations there about how much casualties the Russian side has suffered, according to his view, he still says, well, he's grinding it out. So he still, even then, acknowledges that the balance of power is on the Russian side. But then Putin went a little bit further, I think, to try to lay the foundation from his perspective, how these negotiations probably ought to go, when he talked about some of the fundamentals and the core reasons why he fought in the first place.
We're also open for dialogue with the new US administration on the Ukrainian conflict. The most important thing here is to eliminate the fundamental reason for the conflict. That's the most important. And as for settling the situation itself, its goal should be not a brief ceasefire, not just getting some time to regroup and rearm and carry on the conflict, but long-term peace based on respect to lawful interests of all people and nationalities living in the region. And of course, we're going to fight for the interests of Russia and its people. This is actually the goal and point of the special military operation.
Okay, so let's take that couple of those parts there in particular, look at them a little bit more interesting. So first, he said we're not looking for a ceasefire, because he said in that case it would just give everybody a chance to rearm and regroup, and then the fighting will continue on. Now, that also echoes back to something that Sergei Lavrov said, where he said any kind of a ceasefire is basically a road to nowhere. It's not going to be done because, and he mentioned the same thing. They said that'll just give Ukraine time to rearm and refit. And again, if you're on the military ascendancy and if you have the balance of power in your favor, you have no motivation to have a ceasefire at all, because yes, your side would also rearm and refit and get some training, but then that would give the other side a chance to possibly bring the balance more into its own favor, because the Ukraine side desperately needs a ceasefire. They absolutely would benefit from stopping that, because then there would be lots of weapons and ammunition to come in. They would be able to stockpile it up. It's very, very difficult to get it to the front line as it is, because it's being interdicted at so many points within Ukraine at a much higher rate than the Ukraine side through its long-range drones and a couple of missiles that it gets through is doing to the Russian side. Plus, they're so much bigger, it's just not going to make any difference on that. But if all of a sudden there were no Russian missiles coming in and they could freely get information and weapons and ammunition and other logistics to the front, that would benefit them much more so, giving their troops a chance to rest. If you're on the Russian side, that's the last thing you want, because you don't want to give them a chance to rest. You want to keep them on the downside. You want to keep them, their morale in the toilet, etc. So they're not going to stop. And I think that is very clear. That's not a negotiating tactic. That is a fact. I think that Russia will not entertain a ceasefire, because that would literally hand over an advantage to the other side when they have it in their power. So we can be sure that that's not going to happen. There won't be a ceasefire. There'll be negotiations, there'll be discussions, but in the context of an ongoing fight. And we're going to see why that's even more important from the Russian side in just a second. Probably the most important thing that Putin said in any of these clips we're showing was the last thing there about why we're fighting. This is the core reason. He said, we are fighting for the people of Russia. That is not just talking about the historic and enduring original lands of Russia, but now then they consider all four of those oblasts in the eastern part of what was Ukraine, according to the Russian side. He considers those Russian citizens. That means the Crimea, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk, and Donetsk. All of those territories they consider Russian citizens. And so when he says for Russians, that's what we're fighting for, that's what he means. And that's important because, as I've showed you many times on that map, there's those gray areas on the battle map I showed, which are part of those four oblasts that are still under Ukrainian control. So he is signaling very clearly that his June 14 lines are still the minimum that he's going to negotiate anything with. And if he doesn't get those lines, then he's almost certainly just going to continue fighting. If he means what he said about no ceasefire, then that is definitely just by default what that means. He's going to continue to move to the west. And I won't go through the tactical updates here. I did that yesterday. I recommend you go back to our archives and look at the show from yesterday. If you want a full tactical update of the whole front, you can see it there. But the important thing to understand is that Russian troops are now just a handful of miles away from another oblast, the Dnipro Oblast. So if Russia continues fighting, they're not going to stop at the Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and the Kherson Oblast. They'll just keep going to the west. And if you look on the map, you'll see the Dnieper River is not that much further away. And once Russia breaks through these lines of defense, the whole thing could crumble. We've talked about that several times before. That appears to be on Putin's mind. He is willing to negotiate, but only from a position of strength and only with the recognition of what he considers his people. Now, there's some other things that may also mean. Is it not just those oblasts there, but there are quite a number. If you look at the demographic map of Ukraine, you'll see that there are a bunch of other places where there are a lot of ethnic Russians. One of the key places is the city of Odessa in the south, and in Kharkiv city in the north. All those are have a lot of very high percentage of Russian people. And if Putin is basically saying that they're Russian citizens, they're Russian people as well, whether citizens or not, but they're Russians, then that may also imply that he will want to continue going to the west anyway. And now we don't know. All we know is what he said on the June 15th lines. What we don't know for sure yet, because they have not said anything recently since Trump has been elected, Russia has not said what their entry-level negotiating positions are. They have implied the June 15th was the last one they have said, but frankly, we don't know. It could be that when Trump's team gets in there, that they say, no, it's the Dnieper River, and we're going to go all the way to Kharkiv city and to take Odessa. We don't know that. But it's being implied that that could be what he has in mind based on his comments there, because that's what he said we're fighting for. That's why we went in. We want security on our western flank. And that could be a rather unpleasant situation for Trump. But for Trump's position as well, even though he didn't say anything about Ukraine during his inaugural address, he did leave some signals here that could very well apply to that situation. He was talking about what his primary goals are for his administration, which is to make the U.S. Armed Forces very strong again. But listen to his definition of what success looks like from his perspective.
Like in 2017, we will again build the strongest military the world has ever seen. We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars that we end, and perhaps most importantly, the wars we never get into.
So the last part of that, the wars we never get into, it harkens back to what he has said previously and what Putin said in that clip I showed you a second ago, that they don't want to get into World War III. Trump does not, under any circumstances, want to get into a war with Russia. That's obviously a good thing, but that's how Trump defines success, avoiding unnecessary wars, especially with a nuclear power. But the thing he said before that, too, is maybe the more important thing that folks in Kiev might want to pay a little more attention to, and that was, he said, success is the wars we end and the ones we get out of. Okay, so we're not actually fighting a war anywhere. So the most likely scenario for what he had in mind when he said that was Ukraine. It could also apply to Israel, with some of the support that we've been giving them, and the fact that we enable the wars that they had been fighting since October of 2023. We'll talk about that separately, but I think the most important target there was the Ukraine side. So he wants to, again, clearly signal something he said many times. He wants to end that war. So if you're Zelenskyy, or if you're a lot of these Western European leaders who have just been all in supporting Biden and all of his, the way he's been talking about throughout the 3 years, we're going to, continue to provide as much support as it takes for as long as it takes, and all that kind of stuff. If you're of that mentality, if that's what you've been, but now then you see, there's a new sheriff in town for the United States, and Trump has come in, he said this, you've seen what Putin has said. So you see the two big gorillas in the room that have been talking. You should say, all right, let's read the room here. And Biden's not here anymore. And all of that stuff the last 3 years, that ain't going to fly anymore. So let's start adapting to the new reality. That's what should be happening. But it doesn't seem to be happening. First, let's go to Kiev and see how Volodymyr Zelenskyy is responding to all this.
І зараз для цього є хороший шанс. Інаугурація нового президента Сполучених Штатів Дональда Трампа. Він сильна людина. Я бажаю успіху президенту Трампу, всій Америці. Українці готові працювати разом з американцями, щоб досягти миру, справжнього миру. Це шанс, яким потрібно скористатись. Слава Україні!
Okay, when he says we want to have a just peace, his definition is a little different than the one from Vladimir Putin may be. And he has many times, and we've shown it so many times on our channel, where he's thinking a just peace means we get in NATO, we have security guarantees from the West and from the United States, and yeah, we'll have to temporarily give up some of our territory, but we'll get that back through diplomacy. That's been his statement as recently as a month ago. Well, it's not, again, Biden's not behind you anymore. And you got to read the room. And there were, according to Ukrainian media reports, Zelenskyy tried desperately to get invited to the inauguration. He wanted to be in that room. And 3 times he was told, no, you're not coming. And according to some sources, he was just really begging. And really, he was told no. And then he kept asking. And he said no. So you should recognize that you're not going to get the peace that you're looking for. And you need to be making some significant changes. Just on the political / diplomatic level, you should be able to read the room and see that. Now, one of the things that's making it hard for Zelenskyy to read that is that other European leaders who have not rotated out, have not been voted out, seem to still be stuck in Biden land. First of all, let's go to the UK and see what Keir Starmer has to say about recognizing the real.
I'm proud to speak for the whole of the United Kingdom when I say we are with you, not just today or tomorrow, for this year or the next, but for 100 years, long after this terrible war is over.
100 years. They literally signed a 100-year treaty, which is just absurd. I mean, who can say what's going to happen in a year from now, much less 10 years or 100 years from now? But that's the mentality that he's going in there. Now, that's all said with the certainty of what Trump is saying. Even before he came into office, he has been crystal clear that there's going to be a negotiated settlement. Everything Keith Kellogg has said, he wants it within 100 days. He wants it wrapped up. He wants it done. That's after Keith Kellogg had said that publicly. And so then why do you want to come in and say, even though I know what the United States is not going to support, I'm going to say we're still with you? How many times have we shown you videos like that of Keir Starmer saying those kind of things? Like, no, I just don't want it to be that way. We're going to continue going on. Another one who's making it hard for Zelenskyy, who's also playing into the same, apparently reading from the same playbook that he is, and that is Emmanuel Macron from France. And he was making some comments about his view about things. Gary, if you can throw that screen out there, thank you. This is what he said. Let's see, I believe this is today. This is today's news. Let us not delude ourselves, Macron said earlier during his New Year's address. He was talking to the French armed forces earlier today. This conflict will not end tomorrow or the day after. It is essential to provide Ukraine with the means to endure, to negotiate from a position of strength in the future, he said. He also stressed the need to ensure Ukraine's security, i.e. guarantees, and prevent a resurgence of war on its territory. Folks, those are just fantasies. I mean, here you have the leaders of France and the Great Britain who were just off the charts. They can't read a room. They are totally disconnected from reality. And look, I mean, we're talking right now about here comes Trump, has been crystal clear before he was inaugurated and now since continues to say it. And they're talking as though it's still Joe Biden in here, as though they can just, it's not going to happen. We need to go from a position of strength. And that, especially from Macron, will be one of the greatest condemnations of his entire tenure, in my view, when all this is said and done. Because even without Trump saying a word, they should be just able to look at the ground. They should be able to look at the battle map. They should be able to look at what I did on depicting yesterday about the conditions on the ground, that the Ukraine army is falling apart. The Russian army is getting bigger and stronger and more capable. And the lines keep moving to the west. There is no scenario where the Ukraine side can negotiate from a position of strength. As I have also in a previous episode here graphically shown, that the last chance they had, both Ukraine and the West, to negotiate a good deal from a position of strength that with the Russians were relatively weak was November 2022. And you had Chairman of the Joint Staff, Mark Milley, actually publicly said that. We know from the New York Times just a couple of days ago that they're now reporting that it was the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken who sabotaged that deal. Unbelievable. I mean, that's, you talk about blight on somebody. We'll talk about that in more detail another day. But just imagine that the Secretary of State of the United States, the chief diplomat, sabotaged a deal and deep sixed it that could have ended the war there at terms that would have been beneficial to the Ukraine side. They'll never get the deal they could have gotten in November 2022. They could have gotten a relatively good deal at that time, but they destroyed it. And now then, how much Ukrainian territory has been lost because of their unwillingness to just acknowledge reality, even when their own military guy tried to say so publicly. But that's where they were. Problem is, you see these leaders are still there. If it was clear in November 2022, while Ukraine had its two signature victories, the only two they would ever get in Kherson and Kharkiv, now how much less will they ever have a chance to negotiate from a position of strength? And yet you see these guys are saying that. Now, I think we may also be seeing a shift in the balance of power in Europe itself, because I think that there's every reason to think that here in the near term and the medium term is that the Europeans are going to start going, the Western guys, the guys who've always been in the power, France and UK and Germany, you guys have been off your rocker wrong. But not all the European leaders have been wrong. Let's take a look at Robert Fico from Slovakia, who has been outspoken that he's just about had enough of Zelensky.
Nie som na to, aby som išiel po ruke prezidentovi Zelenskému. A priznám sa, že už niekedy mám plné zuby. Chodí po tej Európe, len žobre a vydiera, ostatných pýta peniaze. Jednoducho toto musí skončiť. Skúste trošku myslieť aj na túto krajinu. Nie iba na svoje úzkoprosé politické cieľe. Čo budeme robiť pre Boha, keď ten plyn nebude? Vy si myslíte, že Nemci nám pošlú plyn, keď oni budú mať málo? Nepošlú nám nič. Nič nám nepošlú.
So he has just basically, obviously, he's definitely for the end to the war, but he is putting his political life on the line. He knows if you don't know much about the Slovak internal dynamics, he's facing a really hard battle with the opposition forces in his country who want to turn a strong turn back to the West and to the European Union. But he has been saying, hey, look, I don't care what the European Union is saying. We got to end this thing. And I want his argument there. And that clip I just showed was about the fact that unlike how it's been through the first of the war, that the Ukraine side had cut off the gas that had been coming from Russia at a much lower rate. Now then they have to get it elsewhere at a much higher rate. And so he says that negatively impacts our economy. He wants to have business with both. Ironically, some of the same dynamics are at play here inside Slovakia as that were in Ukraine in 2014, where you had a strong pro-Western view and a strong pro-Russian view, and the battle between the two ended up turning, in that case, into a so-called color revolution, a coup if you're in the Russian side. But he's willing to risk that because he doesn't want to choose one side or the other. He wants to do what's going to benefit his country the most. And so he's willing to risk his political life because he faced a vote of no confidence, which was originally scheduled for today, but literally at the last minute, even as early as this morning, it was still on the schedule, but the opposition called it off because they realized they didn't have the votes, and they said, we'll do it at another date. So that'll be determined later. But Fico has succeeded for the moment. But you see how strongly he feels it because he sees when he looks to the West and he's like, you want to get tied up with those guys who are totally divorced from both economic, fiscal, and military reality. And as you know, also one of his other big buddies, which ironically are one from the right, one from the left, but the Viktor Orban from Hungary comes at this and recognizes the same kind of thing. He's a little bit more eloquent here in this clip here, talking about why he is for a negotiated settlement.
In the past 3 years, what I saw was that there is no solution on the battleground. I saw people saying things new. I saw new weapons. I see hundreds of people dying, people maimed, women remaining without their husbands, and children remaining without their fathers. So I saw many things, but I don't see how this would bring a solution. Now, if you can't find a solution on the battleground, then you have to do something else. You have to communicate, you have to talk, you have to negotiate, you have to have diplomacy. Diplomacy should take precedence over military engagement.
Why is that such a eye-opening statement today? It is. I don't know that I'll ever fully be able to come to the grasp of how we got to the point here to where simple acknowledgement that you look on the ground, you see things aren't going your way, you look at the balance of power and the balance of forces, and you see that your side's never going to win. So let's have a negotiated settlement. Let's use diplomacy to end the killing and to get this chapter completed and start rebuilding for something new. That should be common, basic sense. And it used to be. And it is just hard for me to fathom how you have so many in the West, led by Starmer, Schultz, Macron, and a handful of others on the European side, just detached from reality. Now, I get it. You have an objective. You have an agenda. You want this certain thing to be true. You're willing to put some capital behind it, political, physical, military capital. You want to try and get an outcome of your benefit. I know in most cases, just being honest, they take the morals out of it. I know we all like to say every side always talks about how it's doing the moral thing or whatever, but at the heart of it, state relationships are based on hard power. What you can do, what you can't do, what you want to do, what you're prohibited from doing. Those are supposed to balance it out. What we're doing here violates those historic rules, and we're talking millennia, thousands of years of human engagement at the state level have been based on an acknowledgement that this is what you can do, this is what you can't. That's not happening in Western Europe right now. They're taking a look at ground truth realities and just doing this. Yeah, I don't like that one, so I'm going to blind myself. I'm just not going to look at it, and I'm going to keep going down here, even though your side is losing by the day and your credibility is going in the tank. And the Ukrainian people are paying for it in blood by the day and in destruction of their territory. That's what's going on with this. That's what the result of this unwillingness or inability. I don't know, maybe it's an inability. But let me tell you what is the ground truth reality. The Russians, as Putin said in the first clip, they're willing to talk. They're looking forward to it. They want dialogue. Apparently, the Russians are still in what has been through thousands of years of interstate relations. They're still on just an acknowledgement of the reality. We would like to have a negotiated settlement, but we're prepared not to have one. Minister of Defense Bulasov is acknowledged that the Russian army plans on victory in 2025. Their objectives, which match what Putin has said previously, that the entire territory of 4 Ukrainian regions, the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and the Zaporizhia regions, will be won by 2025. He is not talking about any diplomacy. He's talking about a resourced, rational plan to military conquer Ukraine to get all of those regions, not the whole country, but those regions. And he believes that they'll have that done. And there's every reason physically, realistically on the ground to see that they're going to have that they can succeed on that. One of the reasons is not just because of the size of their force, the number of troops that they have, but on the other half of this equation, and that's on the Ukraine side. This didn't get much notice in the Western press, but it should have. This should have been one of the first things that Trump was given, because this is the General Sersky from the Ukraine side has admitted in public that they do not have enough men to even sustain the combat losses. So he says that unfortunately mobilization does not cover demand from the front line. What that translates into is that the casualties we have on a daily or a monthly basis are not being offset by the recruits that we're bringing in. And so militarily, what that means is not just the mathematics that the Ukraine army is shrinking by the day. The Russian army mathematically is growing by the day because their mobilization and their recruiting efforts rather are higher than their daily casualty rate, whatever the number actually is. I'm sure it's much higher than a lot of in Russian are comfortable with, but it's still, the losses are less than those coming in. So their force continues to grow. We've had a couple of them on our show before. We've shown you that they have all the resources they need. They have the ammunition. They have the equipment. They get rest when they need it. They get rotated off the front sometimes. The way a war is supposed to be fought. Ukraine, on the other hand, is not only shrinking, but that means that every time they get these people thrust into uniform that don't want to be there because they're being forced mobilized, they don't have the capacity or the time to train them up. And so they just shuttle them straight to the front with no training. So whatever kind of experience people keep getting, it keeps dropping because the leaders keep getting killed. And then they just get thrown more and more people in here who can pull the trigger on a rifle and maybe guide a drone, but that's about the extent of it. They don't know how to conduct a maneuver, even defensive maneuver, which you have to do to launch local counterattacks when an offensive force is pushing into you. You've got to be able to maneuver to hit it into flank, and that's a complicated operation. Ukraine has almost lost that ability. And then you have cases like this recent one here where the commander of a Ukrainian brigade that was trained in France, we talked about that 2 or 3 weeks ago, has actually been arrested. This colonel from the Ukrainian army was a veteran combat commander, best known for taking over a troubled brigade in 2023 and turning it into an effective fighting outfit. and then was selected for assignment as a senior officer of the 155th Separate Brigade. They have now arrested him because the troops, when they were trained in France, they came back and I think like 1,700 of them fled and just departed. So that made this brand new, allegedly well-trained unit combat ineffective before it even got to the front. And listen, they need to pay attention to this on the Ukraine side, and certainly on the Western European and in Washington. You have a guy here who had proven himself successful in combat, and then you gave him these people and took him out of the country so that they would be safe to train them up. But when they came back, the people have such low morale, and they do recognize the reality on the ground. They knew that it would be basically suicide to come back and fight, and they would choose to rather flee and leave their own compatriots behind and leave those soldiers who didn't leave hanging out in the wind to fight an ineffective force to try to go into a Russian buzzsaw. And so it doesn't matter even if you have a well-trained leader, because they don't have the capacity at the troop level to be able to fight. This is, again, a premier organization entity. The 155th Brigade was supposed to be an elite, and it melted away before it came in contact. And then when you look along the current lines with, you're talking about the Kursk region, the Kharkiv battlefront lines, the Kupiansk area, Torets, Chasiv Yar, all of which are just barely about, especially the last two are, Torets actually has effectively already been lost. Chasiv Yar is hanging by a thread. The Pokrovsk area keeps getting cut lower. The troops are now within visual range of the outskirts of the city. For the Russians, they're moving in the southern side to even capture more of that. There's a number of cauldrons, which the Ukrainian side is at risk of getting cut off in a number of different areas, and they don't have the number of troops. Other than that, wow, it's a toss-up. You see what I'm saying? There is no fundamental reason why. This is not an emotional issue. It's not an opinion. It's the fundamentals and math show that Ukraine can't win. And so now that here, to get back to the start of this, when you have Trump coming in, he's going to have to recognize one other thing here. Russia doesn't need a negotiated settlement. They can continue to win. And as a German general, I believe it was a former general, also revealed in public, he raised an alarm that said, hey, not only is Russia not losing more men than they're bringing in, they're actually building up their forces beyond the requirements. We see that the Russian armed forces are not just able to compensate for their enormous personnel losses on their own, but they are successfully rearming. The general said that the Russian military was acquiring more tanks, more ammunition, more missiles, more drones. Production is growing. The supplies in the depots are growing, he said, because he went on to warn that in the future, 5 to 8 years from now, that the Russians may be in a position militarily on the operational level to actually attack into NATO. Now, whether that would happen or not, I have serious doubts for very practical reasons. But they are building up for that case, because from the Russian side, they see that these kinds of comments, and that they see all this increase in national defense spending for a lot of these European states. They are also saying, well, we have to do this. So you see, they're already thinking beyond the end of this war, both sides, Europe and Russia, about a potential war. So Trump has to come to the condition that, hey, do I really want to try to drag this out? Do I really want to try to press for some kind of a good outcome that, rationally speaking, isn't going to be there? And maybe Ukraine doesn't have a negotiated settlement along even close to the June 15 line, but up to the Dnieper River. Because I'm just telling you categorically, it's almost certain, nothing's ever guaranteed in warfare, but it's extremely likely that if the negotiations drag out, that the Russians will simply just continue their operations without pause until they get to the Dnieper River. And then that would mean the loss of Odessa. That would mean the loss of Kharkiv city. And then it would be putting Kiev literally at risk. And then probably they're going to get an issue of surrender, terms of surrender, or the Russians would just probably keep going. There's just almost nothing that can be done to stop them short of declaring war against Russia and sending Western troops in, which, although that would be foolish to do for so many reasons, and it still wouldn't successfully stop the Russians. All it would do is expand the war into World War III, which both Trump and Putin say they want to avoid. Ergo, the most likely course is that Trump negotiate some kind of a deal quickly to get this off the table before it's lost. That's what the rational thing to do would be. You see Fico, you see Orban recognize this. Others are starting to. And Trump is definitely no Keir Starmer or Emmanuel Macron or Olaf Scholz, and definitely not a Joe Biden. So we'll see what happens with that. But that's the reality, folks, of where we are and what is facing the Trump administration when it comes in. It is not going to be easy. The outcome will be ugly, guaranteed. There's no pretty way to do this because we didn't do Istanbul in April 2022. We didn't do November 2022 when we had the best chance. So now then the only thing we're left with is an ugly outcome, but that's better than a catastrophic one. That's your options right now. A bad outcome, an ugly one, or a catastrophic one where the Ukraine flat out loses the war. That is very much a real possibility here. We'll see how President Trump chooses to handle this. And as this stuff goes on in the next couple of days, I think, we'll probably get some meetings set up pretty soon between the two sides here, and we'll definitely be covering that for you and bringing it to you as it happens, as we always do, because we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, no matter what it is, because you deserve it. Thank you very much. We'll see you on the next episode, which happens to be at 3:30 p.m. this afternoon with Matthew Ho, former State Department official. Hadn't had him on a while. Really looking forward to that. He's going to have some great insights to discuss on some of this stuff as well. Thanks, and we'll see you then on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.